So good afternoon, everyone. As Doug mentioned, I'm Caroline Bennet and my co-presenter today is Darryl Wagner. We are both partners at Deloitte, myself here in Asia Pacific and Darryl in the US. And we have worked together for a number of years now around the topic, I guess, of the future of work and what it means for actuaries. And I am continuing the sort of theme of travel and jet lag. I think I am very pleased to say that for once I'm at a global meeting in my own time zone. I don't think Darryl and I have ever presented this material ever, where I'm in my time zone and he's not, so this is fantastic. And so the genesis of the material we're presenting today is that Darryl and I co-presented at ICA 2018. Myself, I didn't actually get there because at the time it was too far away, but we did prepare the material together. But Darryl presented our material around what we called at the time the exponential actuary and the view we had around the changed role of the actuaries. And I guess we reflected coming into this ICA meeting that with the events of the past 5 years, and in particular the pandemic period, things actually, in some ways accelerated towards the changed future and in other ways stopped in that period. And so we wanted to I guess, reflect again on the future of work and actuaries, and so that is really what we're presenting today. So if I just briefly outline, I guess, the way our presentation will run today, I will talk us through what we see as what some of those trends over the last few years have been, particularly using the lens of the workforce, the workplace and the work itself. And then we will turn to the topic that we see as particularly interesting as well around what this means for talent, learning and development. And concluding with, I guess, 4 shifts that we see as particularly important. So in terms of some of the global workforce trends that we've seen over the last few years, and so starting with the great exhaustion and the things that happened in 21 or 20 and 21 in particular. So some really interesting stats, some of them quite staggering, in terms of things like the number of meetings per person, the number of chats people were having to participate in, and the volume of work that people are doing out of hours. You can see, given some of those statistics, why then some of the others are following in terms of people being not that satisfied with their work-life balance or their jobs overall. And some also stark trends here noted around the workforce. These are actually US statistics in terms of pre-pandemic, women making up more than 50% of the workforce, but in the intervening period, very significant numbers of women leaving the workforce and still not returning. That period also led to a significant change in migration patterns and also changes in, I guess, people's intentions of movement as well. So a significant movement observed of people moving cities, but also people considering in much greater numbers applying for roles that are not based near their current homes. Also a significant increase in the movement of people globally, as we can see here in a whole set of different corridors, dramatically increased movement of workforce. And then the other significant movement around employee agency in terms of individuals having very strong preferences around the ability to work remotely, with people being much more willing to quit a job that they're not enjoying, and the importance of health and wellbeing programs and flexibility. And then the Great Resignation, as everyone has obviously already seen plenty about, but again, just some really interesting statistics in terms of, the reduced number of people in the labour market, extensive reporting of lack of skilled workers, and the volume of workers that are looking for new roles. And here we have statistics just across a number of markets, but they are extraordinarily consistent in terms of the proportions of workforce members who are open to looking to new roles. And then finally, the sentiment element around the flexible environment, the strong sentiment from people's teams that they do want a very flexible post-pandemic environment, but with employers still working through how that could work, will work, and whether they want it to work. So if we just then, on that very point, look at the return to office statistics and whether there is an ongoing debate or not, these statistics would say it's not, with 75% of millennials and Gen Z saying that they prefer hybrid work, and 65% of females also making the same observation, and a really strong expectation around being in the office less than 5 days a week. And so I guess our view would be the debate to be having now is very much the one about what works well in person and what works well remotely, and really working through for an actuarial team which elements need to be done in person because they are that much more productive. And so I guess the observations here are sort of self-evident, but idea generation, networking, creativity clearly do benefit from being in person, but that actually the remote element is benefited or is just as or no less effective when it comes to things like prioritisation and selection of ideas versus the generation, and that in fact the benefits of the satisfaction and retention, that obviously there is a real merit in finding the path to a balance that, as all the previous statistics have shown, are desired by the workforce. So turning it squarely now to the actuarial question, I guess our view would be that with the changes in work and workplace, there is a real need to continue to look at strategies that will maximise the output of the function but also meet stakeholder expectations. And the expectations have clearly been pretty strong for some time that our actuarial functions need to do more, probably with less in terms of cost, as well as delivering more insight. So there is a real ask, an increasing ask of our teams, but particularly the cognitive technologies and how can they be leveraged to generate either capacity for people to spend on then higher value activities, or in fact additional insight creation. How do you, I guess, have the capacity to meet expectations while the cost demand is probably increasing? The ongoing regulatory changes have absolutely, particularly through this period over the last few years of disruption to the workplace and the workforce, have clearly been very significant in many markets, with things like the LDTI and IFRS 17 changes, and people have found ways to work much more flexibly and effectively while meeting their obligations. And then, how does that balance work for actuaries, particularly of virtual and physical workplaces, and really also, to the point that we'll come to in a moment, get the development and training from the in-person element, which over the last few years was challenged, but which obviously does need to be found on an ongoing basis in the hybrid model. So just with coming to the sort of end of these trends part of our presentation, a significant expectation that automation will impact jobs going forward, that we will have less face-to-face interactions on a persistent basis, and that the combination of change means that companies do believe they will need a different mix of talent in the future to they have today. So that trend, which was also part of the hypothesis that we were talking about 5 years ago, remains, and if anything, has only been accelerated. And in the context of the actuarial function, I guess our hypothesis remains, as it did then, that there is absolutely an efficiency gain to be had, but frees up capacity to allow the value creation that stakeholders are looking for. But there are significant training, development and capability areas to focus on that are needed to get there. So I think I might now hand to Darryl.
Thank you, Caroline, and good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here with you. I guess I'll give my jet lag story. I also arrived Saturday from the US. I have not yet tried the 8-hour nap. And I think if I do take a nap this afternoon, I'm going to set the alarm so I don't sleep through cocktails. And yes, Caroline, we have presented all over the world, and usually it's you with the jet lag, so I'm happy to take my turn this time. I love the theme for this conference, the Bridge to Tomorrow, especially in a city known for its iconic bridges. And by the way, on one of my previous visits to Australia, I did climb the Sydney Bridge, and that might cause some eye rolling among the Australians. I'm sure it's a very touristy thing, but I do recommend it. And if any of you are nervous about it, I will just say that their safety protocols are quite robust, so I wouldn't worry about that. But I love that theme for this presentation as well, because I think in the context of talking about the future of the actuary, the future of the actuarial profession, I would say that the bridge to tomorrow is you. It's all of us. It's those of us that make up the profession. And I want to give a special call out to the more recent or newer entrants to the profession. And I trust there are some of you here in the audience today. You will be living more of that future than those of us that have been in the profession longer. And so I do invite you to weigh in and into the Q&A as we get into the conversation. Would love to hear your perspectives on that. I would also say I'm going to talk about a spectrum of evolution, I guess you could say, in a way. And I realize that some of you within your organizations, within your associations, your markets, or even as individuals may have gone further in that evolution, and would certainly love to hear about the learnings and best practices any of you would like to share about that as well. So picking up where Caroline left off here, as we talk about changes to the actuarial function and really to the actuary themselves, I would come back to that bridge to tomorrow. How do we begin to create and really equip and empower the actuary of the future to be all that they can be? And some of the motivators, and I guess one of the ways I would say this is I think, so the rise of AI data science, the way I think of it is I think we have a responsibility to make the most, to capitalize as much as we can on the resources available to us and take the work of our craft, what we do, as far as possible. So that's a motivator, but it's also an enabler and part of responsibility. I think the analytics acumen comes along with that. And Scott, by the way, I think what you took us through is a perfect case study around this future of the actuary, which I'll come back to here in a minute. But also you see pressure from business leaders. I think the environment around us is changing, and I would say it's not just pressure from business leaders, but the world around us is offering more and more complex, dynamic, global, multifaceted issues and problems for us to weigh in on. So that, I think, also calls us in terms of our responsibility as a profession and to our stakeholders, our public, and to ourselves. So all of these things, I would say, call us, and the teaming that's going to be a part of the theme of my remarks as well. How we get that done, a lot of that is through teaming, and Scott talked about this as well, how we team, who we team with, and teaming itself as a core competency of the actuary. Now, there are some barriers, and you can see them listed there. Again, some of this is new. It's newer for some more than others, but we'll get into that. So actually, if we go to the next slide, I've got the control here. So I want to introduce this idea of the super job, and this is a phrase we've coined as we've talked about this subject. And Scott, your advanced analytics actuary, I would gladly add to this list. I think it's a great example of a super job. And so what's the super job for an actuary? It's not necessarily something new, but what I would say these things have in common is they're outcome focused, looking at a particular business outcome. They are taking advantage of the things we just talked about the technology available, addressing more complex issues. They are combining expertise, the expertise of the actuary with other domain expertise, perhaps in the same person sometimes, as a hybrid person, perhaps in a team, and perhaps more often in a team. And I think these are also jobs that allow us to amplify our purpose, our mission. One of the things I love most, I'm most proud of being an actuary, is the good we do for society and for the public that we serve. And I think all of these things allow us to take that to another level. As an example, an algorithm auditor, someone who can look at an algorithm and not check the math, but more understand what's the thinking behind it, what are the parameters behind it, when will that algorithm perhaps cease to make sense or need to be refreshed, updated. And with the importance of algorithms in the world today, I don't think I need to tell you how important that could be. The AI expert here is really talking about how can we bring AI increasingly to the work of actuaries. And Caroline mentioned some of the work we've done around the future of work. I've had the opportunity to be involved in creating and being part of some of those kinds of teams where we've taken actuaries who know what they do, combined with technologists who know new and emerging technologies and figure out how to combine them together in creative ways. And that's another example of a super job an actuary could play. One that's not on here, and I'm sure some of you are experiencing IFRS 17, long duration targeted improvements. We have a lot of change in the accounting for insurance worldwide. So the idea of the storyteller, someone who can explain what's happening with the earnings of a company, or really the story that the accounting for that company is telling, speaking the language of that accounting, if you will, I think is an emerging super job as well. So if those are the super jobs, we need some actuarial superheroes, some super actuaries. And this next part of the presentation is going to talk a little bit about how do we create those super actuaries and how do we equip them, prepare them to be as much of a superhero as they can be. This slide is talking about skills versus capabilities. And Scott, you covered this very well. I'm gonna make one change to the way you presented it, which is to not call soft skills soft skills. And if you've heard me present on this topic before, you've heard me say that. And the reason for that is I think the term soft skill sounds a little bit inferior. So it's something fluffy, nice to have, maybe you don't need to have. In the world in which we live, particularly with the rapid change at which the more technical and business aspects of what we do are changing so rapidly, I really see these, we'll call them human capabilities or enduring human capabilities, as really the cornerstones of an actuary through their career. You mentioned several, Scott, building confidence in the work we do, selling it, being an advocate. It might be communicating, influencing, negotiating, leading, and some of those involve lots of different skills taken together. But more and more, I think, again, those are the enduring skills that are going to help an actuary navigate a career, but they're also the skills that are going to be needed to figure out the left-hand side of the page and how we deal with all the changes that are happening in the businesses we serve, in the technology we work with, and how to combine those. So at the risk of overusing the bridge metaphor, I think the secret sauce of the actuary in many ways is building the bridge, not not just on the left-hand side between the business and the technology and the science, but between the right and left side of the page, and bringing those skills that Scott gave a great example of, which allow the work we do to really make a difference to the people that we're doing it for. And again, not a new concept. As a profession, we've been doing this for many years, but I think everything that's going on around us is just making it even more important that we double down on those skills and integrate them even more than we have in the past. So just talking a little bit about more traditional, this says current. Again, I'm sure we're seeing some organizations start to change. And Scott kind of alluded to this, but typically speaking, and I went through a development like this, the earlier part of your career, you learn your technical fundamentals of the profession, which, by the way, is extremely important. So by no means would I suggest that we don't need to do that anymore, but I'll come back to how this might look a little differently in a minute. From there, it's natural to move more into understanding the business, the judgment. I think we've all had that experience where we, as a new actuary, took some numbers to the boss who immediately said, no, those don't look right, and we couldn't figure out how they knew that, but that's that acumen, that intuition, that judgment that develops over time. And then over on the right, of course, going on to leadership, influencing, and communication. And I know this is a bit of an eye chart. I won't drain all the points here, but the challenges that are noted there really have to do with the availability of the training or the support in these different areas, the timeliness of that. And I want to give a call out to our universities, our actuarial associations, I think are doing a great job and more all the time of keeping our syllabus and other tools current, but it's obviously at the speed at which things are changing, it's almost impossible to do that. So the timeliness and also the deliberation, the customization of that, I think is a challenge. I'd also say this being more linear, I think is something we need to challenge. So there's no reason someone needs to wait until later in their career to begin to be a leader, nor does it necessarily should it be an automatic thing that someone at a certain point of time should now be a leader. I think we've really, part of the message here is, are we doing our best to understand the individual, how we match that person's skills and desires and capabilities up with the needs of the business and the mission that we're trying to accomplish, and do that in a more deliberate way. And obviously that's not an easy challenge because it takes time, it takes investment, and it takes partnership. And I do want to say right here, I mentioned universities and actuarial associations. I view this definitely as a partnership between those entities along with the employers, the organizations for which the actuaries are working to figure this out, along with we ourselves as actuaries pursuing our own learning and kind of steering all that as we go through our own careers. So how might that look different? A couple of examples here. I think coming back to using our enduring human capabilities, I think we've got to be creative. I think we've got to be innovative and think differently. Think outside the box, if you will, the box of the organizational chart in terms of how we craft career experiences, craft development opportunities for actuaries and for ourselves. So a couple of examples here on teaming. Could we be more deliberate in setting up shadowing where an actuary is working with someone outside of their main sphere, a business partner, if you will, so they learn more about how that partner thinks, which informs their thinking better. Communication and storytelling. I think this is something certainly we try to do even with our newer, less experienced actuaries. Is in some context it won't be a board of directors meeting, but in some context there can be an opportunity for them to make a presentation, tell their story, and any opportunity like that brings with it the opportunity to think about audience and some of the other to-dos of communication. So these are a couple of examples, I think, of how this could be done differently and look differently. And these, I throw these out as thought provokers. There's no one right answer. There's no clear answer here. And hopefully we can have some dialogue, and would love to hear thoughts from the group on what you've seen work well. So another proposal around this is if we look at these kind of same three areas that we talked about before, technical development, business, and leadership, I think in some ways what we're saying is taking a more balanced approach to that throughout one's career, to each of those areas, and doing it, if you go through the descriptions here, doing it in a more deliberate, a more targeted way. That might be by the way we set up someone's environment, the team that they're part of. It might be in the educational side, and I know a number of our actuarial associations are beginning to do more micro-credentialing. This mentions micro-rotations. So is it possible to have smaller segments of learning or work segments that help get at some of those different skill sets? And just be more tailored and more individualized in what we do, which as I said, is not easy, does take investment, and what we're talking about here actually becomes another human capability that we need to master and increasingly use in terms of just how we help our people develop and structure the environment and teams they work on in the right way. And I do believe that the return on that investment makes it well worth it. So I want to go through just a couple of examples of, we'll call it kind of old and new, and again, realize some of you may have already moved beyond old, but if we just talk about career progression, I think I would say we've been a bit siloed at times. You would have kind of a chief actuary or a management role position, perhaps something that's a more traditional role. One of the reasons I left an insurance company fairly early in my career is the paths to me seemed a little bit binary. There was kind of a management track and a more of a personal contribution track. And I like the idea of mixing the two. And that's one of the things I've really enjoyed working as a consultant is that I feel like I pretty regularly am living in each of those three columns that we talked about earlier. That works for me. Some are going to prefer to spend more time in one column or another. And by the way, I do want to give a call out to diversity here. And for those of you that did not have a chance to attend the diversity conference yesterday, it was a great session. It's been recorded. I'd highly encourage you to check it out. But what we're talking about here, I think, is a natural way to also build diversity into what we do, of teaming with others, of kind of breaking the organizational construct. And on the right there, you can see how might this happen. A lot of it has to do with actuaries working with other professionals, other disciplines, other specialists to achieve a goal. I'm a financial reporting guy by background, so I mentioned IFRS 17 earlier, but I think we've got a lot of great momentum in that side of the profession out of what's happened over the last few years as actuaries have really had to team with accounting experts, with technology experts, with change experts to get done what needed to be done to implement such a new complex accounting standard. So I'd love to see that continue and spark into new directions. How might we think about learning differently? Traditionally, exams, some path of qualification, of course, to becoming a qualified actuary, and then continuing ed beyond that. As I said, this evolution is certainly already in process, but again, moving towards a more micro view, more than continuing ed, maybe as we think about that left side of the skills page, how do we keep up with what's changing? And at the same time, how do we bolster those enduring human capabilities on the right side of the page? I also think we have to be clear of where we need help even as a profession. So I don't know that it makes sense for our actuarial associations to be the one who are taking the lead on helping folks develop human capabilities. A lot of that probably comes from apprenticing and the teams they're on and other educational avenues. So making sure we're thinking broadly in terms of learning as a profession, I think is really important. And then in the workplace, Caroline talked about this quite a bit, and this change has already happened. So the old way is a few years behind us now in terms of being in the office. but certainly not just being hybrid, but the different forms of employment engagement we're seeing that a hybrid environment kind of contributes to. And when you think about that 3-pillar slide, changing the work environment as dramatically as we have, I think really creates some important shifts in the way we think about how those things happen. And I guess I would say I have two fears around this. One is a fear that our newer entrants, especially our actuarial students, are not getting access to apprenticeship and to training because there's not as much in-person interaction. So that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is I fear that we who are more experienced are not being open enough and creative enough to different ways for that to happen, because it doesn't have to happen the way it happened for us. And I think somewhere in between there, we've got to find the right balances. And again, would love to hear thoughts or questions on that point. So just to wrap up here, I think a few shifts that I think this all calls us to think about. As I said, one from jobs to skills, and I think beyond just the skills and capabilities themselves is how do we think about roles? How do we define roles? Do we even think in terms of roles anymore? Is it, are we more outcomes focused? From employees to workforce ecosystems. So I think this is both in terms of how we set up our own teams internally and the kinds of people we have on those teams, but also the way we're engaging with employers, contractors, gig workers. How do we bring together an ecosystem for any particular organization? Flex work to flex everything. Okay, that's pretty broad, but I think the point here is really thinking very holistically. And I talked about all the reasons why we need to take this on, about the technology, about the problems our world face. I think another important reason is for we as actuaries, for the folks in our profession. How can we make this the most rewarding profession possible? And by the way, I think that is really important to us continuing to thrive as a profession. Is I want to be a profession that people are excited about joining and see opportunities. And so that's another reason why all this is so important. And I really believe we have the opportunity to offer that. And then finally, from automation to augmentation, we haven't talked about this as much, but I do sometimes get the question, especially from some of our actuarial students, less experienced actuaries, is, well, what's going to happen with automation? Is our work going to go away? And I had a conversation like this just on the way to the airport for this trip. And what I said is, I don't see this as an or conversation, it's an and. I think that we as actuaries can have technology do a lot of good things to support what we do, and in a sense allow us to begin what we do at a more elevated state. But that also calls on us for the responsibility of figuring out what that elevated state is. How are we going to take that to a higher level than we have in the past? If we can find that additional time, what are we going to do with that time? What are the additional outcomes we can achieve? And so maybe I'll close there because, again, that's, to me, the excitement about all this for the profession, and I think the way we create that bridge to tomorrow. Thank you.